Your first $10,000 is a test. Here's what most people do. Wrong. There is a moment in most people's financial lives that feels bigger than it actually is. It happens when someone saves their first $10,000. For a long time, that number feels distant. You budget carefully. You skip purchases. You delay gratification. You tell yourself that once you reach 5 figures, things will finally feel stable. And eventually, after months, or sometimes years, of discipline, you get there. Your account finally shows $10,000. At first, it feels like security. It feels like progress. It feels like proof that your financial life is finally moving forward. But what most people don't realize is that this moment is not the finish line. It's a test. Because what you do with that first $10,000 often determines whether you begin building wealth or quietly reset your financial progress without realizing it. And most people fail this test, not because they are careless, but because they misunderstand what that money is supposed to do. Before we go deeper, welcome to Endora Invest. This channel is for disciplined thinkers, people who care about capital, timing, and long-term alignment. We don't chase hype. We don't sell shortcuts. Instead, we examine the structural decisions that shape wealth and life outcomes. If you value clear, strategic thinking about money and conversations that go beyond surface-level advice, consider subscribing. Now, let's continue. The biggest mistake people make after saving their first $10,000 is not reckless spending. It's something more subtle. They start treating saved money as available money. The money sits in their checking account. They see it every time they open their banking app. And psychologically, it begins to feel like spending capacity. Even if they don't plan to spend it immediately, their behavior begins to change. A slightly nicer purchase feels reasonable. A small upgrade feels justified. A trip feels affordable. Nothing dramatic. Just slightly more relaxed spending. But here's the problem. That $10,000 was never meant to function as spending money. It was meant to function as capital. And capital behaves differently from cash. Cash gets used. Capital gets structured. Most people never make that distinction. And because they don't, their first meaningful savings slowly disappear. $10,000 is a strange financial number. It's big enough to feel significant, but still small enough to be fragile. For many people, saving $10,000 requires real discipline. So reaching it creates a powerful emotional response. You feel like you've finally made progress. But financially speaking, $10,000 is not wealth. It's not enough to retire. It's not enough to absorb multiple serious setbacks. In most places, it's barely enough to cover a few months of living expenses. So, while it feels large emotionally, it is actually early-stage capital. And early-stage capital needs structure. Without structure, it disappears. When people mishandle their first $10,000, the consequences rarely appear dramatic. That's why the mistake is so common. Nothing collapses overnight. Instead, behavior slowly changes. Spending becomes a little easier. Financial caution becomes slightly weaker. You start replacing things earlier than necessary. You justify small purchases because you have savings. Each decision looks harmless in isolation. But the balance begins drifting downward. 10,000 becomes 9,000. Then 8,000. Then 7,000. And because the spending never looked reckless, the person doesn't feel alarmed early enough. Then eventually, something unavoidable happens. A car repair, a medical bill, a broken appliance. Now the savings account takes a real hit. And because the balance had already been drifting downward, that single expense wipes out a large portion of what remains. Suddenly, the person who once had $10,000 is back at $3,000 or $4,000. And psychologically, that feels like failure. Not because saving was useless, but because the capital was never structured correctly. Imagine someone who spent 2 years saving their first $10,000. They worked overtime, they cut expenses, they stayed disciplined. Eventually, they reach their goal. The money sits in their everyday bank account. At first, they leave it alone, but gradually, their thinking changes. They start spending a little more comfortably. They upgrade their phone. They buy furniture. They take a short trip. Nothing extreme, just small improvements to life. Then one unexpected expense appears, perhaps a $2,500 car repair. Now the savings account drops sharply. Suddenly, the balance is closer to $5,000, and psychologically, the milestone feels broken. The motivation that once drove their saving weakens, and the cycle begins again. This happens to millions of people, not because they lack discipline, but because they never converted discipline into financial structure. There are several reasons this pattern repeats. First, money sitting in a checking account feels visible and available. When something is visible, the brain assumes it can be used. Second, modern culture constantly encourages consumption. Upgrade your lifestyle, reward yourself, celebrate progress with purchases. But wealth building works differently. Early capital needs time to compound, and compounding requires patience. The third reason is simple. Most people were never taught how to structure their savings. They know how to earn money. They know how to spend money. But they were never shown how to assign roles to money. And that's the key shift. People who build real financial stability do something very simple when they reach $10,000. They divide it immediately. They stop treating it as one pool of money. Because money works better when each portion has a specific job. The first job is protection. The second job is growth. And separating those two roles changes everything. The first role of your early capital is protection. Life will always produce unexpected costs. Cars break down. Jobs change. Medical issues appear. Without financial reserves, those events create stress and debt. So the first step is establishing a dedicated emergency fund. For many people, allocating $3,000 to $5,000 from that first $10,000 is a practical starting point. But here's the important detail. This money should not remain in your everyday checking account. It should sit in a separate savings account, ideally one that takes a day or two to transfer from. That small barrier creates friction, and friction protects capital. When emergency money is separate, you pause before using it. When it sits next to spending money, it gets used casually. That separation alone prevents many financial resets. Once your emergency buffer is in place, the remaining portion of your savings should begin working for you. This is where investing begins. Not speculation, not gambling, not chasing trends. Just simple participation in long-term economic growth. For many people, that means diversified investments like broad market index funds. The goal is not instant wealth. The goal is compounding. Because compounding transforms modest capital into meaningful wealth over long periods of time. $5,000 invested today may not look impressive, but over decades, its growth can be significant. That's how early capital begins multiplying. But the real difference between people who build wealth and people who stay stuck is not just what they do with their first $10,000. It's what happens afterward. Disciplined investors build systems. They automate progress. Each paycheck, a portion moves automatically into savings. Another portion moves into investments. And life adjusts around what remains. This system removes the need for constant discipline. Because discipline fades. Life becomes busy. Expenses appear. But automated systems continue working quietly in the background. Over time, this transforms financial progress from a struggle into a process. There is another moment when many people fail the $10,000 test. They begin thinking about large purchases, a house down payment, a nicer car, a business idea. These goals are not wrong. But using your entire $10,000 for a major purchase removes your safety margin. And without margin, financial life becomes fragile. Disciplined investors usually wait longer than they emotionally want to. They continue building capital. They increase their reserves. And when they finally make large purchases, they do so from a position of strength, not desperation. If this perspective resonates, if you're realizing that money is only part of the equation, let me know in the comments. I read them carefully. And if you're learning from this conversation and want more long-term strategic thinking about capital and life decisions, subscribe to Endora Invest. Now let's bring this together. The first $10,000 is a quiet turning point. It's large enough to feel meaningful, but small enough to disappear if handled casually. That's why it matters so much, because it forces a decision. Will this money become consumption, or will it become structure? Most people never fail financially because they lack discipline. They fail because discipline was never converted into systems. And without systems, progress resets. Wealth rarely begins with dramatic events. It usually begins with quiet decisions, a separate account, an emergency reserve, an automatic investment, a purchase delayed, a mindset changed. That's how financial stability begins. Not with abundance, but with structure. If you've saved your first $10,000, you should be proud of it. That achievement matters. But understand what it represents. It's not the finish line. It's the beginning of the test. Because from this point forward, the question is no longer, what can this money buy? The real question becomes, what role should this money play? And the moment you start answering that question strategically, that's when wealth building truly begins. And if you're learning from this conversation and want more long-term strategic thinking about capital and life decisions, subscribe to Endora Invest.